Good morning, and this morning we're taking a look at those beautiful verses found in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. But first of all, I want to introduce you to a friend of mine. Here is Growler. I was given Growler when I was about 9 years old, so you can do the maths for yourself as to how old he might be. And he does really look a bit tired and worn, and he's quite bald on his tummy. But you know what? He still growls. Do you have something that you treasure, but that is a bit worn out, a bit broken, a bit damaged? You see, I treasure Growler, my teddy bear, but on the outside, he doesn't really look like much anymore. But I value him and I treasure him for what he means to me, and perhaps because he's still got his growl on the inside. The Corinthian church probably causes Paul the most difficulty of all the churches that he writes to. The background to this letter is that the church were challenging Paul's doctrines, his ministry, and his authority. He loved them, but he feels that they no longer care for him. In fact, they seem to be rejecting him and his teaching. As he writes, he is seeking to draw them back to the truths of the gospel and the fact that he, Paul, lives and breathes the truth of the gospel of Jesus, and he teaches on these truths alone. And so this is the background as we enter chapter 4. And the first 6 verses, he's affirming the light of the gospel and that he is the one who is a slave to Jesus for them. He reminds them and us that we are called to let light shine out of darkness, for God has made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. The imagery of light resonates in so many ways, doesn't it? Think about Paul's own saving experience. The light that he encountered, the light of Christ he encountered on the Damascus Road. And then cast your mind back to the creation account in Genesis, when God spoke and there was light, and it brought light out of the chaos and the darkness. Now God says, there is a light that has come into the world, which is Jesus, and this light comes to a world that is still shrouded in darkness and fear, and that we have it in our hands as his followers. It is the most powerful instrument, the instrument of the good news of Jesus. But he challenges the Corinthians and also us with the question, do we feel helpless in the face of the gods and authorities of this age? Do we feel intimidated and bowed down, a sense that there's just no way out of these circumstances? And then he writes these very well-known verses. But we have this treasure, which is in jars of clay. We might feel weak and feeble on the outside, like my teddy bear, but we have a treasure that lies within. And of course, that treasure is the very light of God, the all-surpassing knowledge of God, which is within us. The image of the jar represents our human body, and like the clay jar, it is ultimately utterly powerless. It will die and fade away. However, the power of the cross, the light of Jesus, will never fail or fade. If our body, spirit and intellect were all that was needed to bring light into the darkness and fear of our world, well, what would be the need for the all-surpassing power of God then? But Paul writes later in chapter 12 of this letter that God's power is made perfect in our weakness. If we had an indestructible body, that would just lead us to pride and arrogance. However, God chooses to take us, complete as we are in our humanity, with his all-surpassing power, his treasure residing in us through the work of Christ. He loves us as we are. However, Paul goes on to describe in verses 8 and 9 so clearly how he feels and how often we feel. For he writes he is hard pressed, precious from all around, perplexed, feels cornered, persecuted, hounded, struck down, perhaps the feeling of being brought low and feeling depressed. But of course, this isn't the completeness of his list, is it? Because alongside this list, there are the list of but not. And Paul says that he's not crushed, he's not in despair, he's not abandoned, and he's not destroyed, because the life of Christ is within him. So while the former list of Paul is an honest appraisal of his situation, if you like, the jar of clay, the human frailty, the latter is the evidence of God's all-surpassing power. So how are we, you and I, right now, in this current situation, personally, in our society, as a gathered people of God, the church? How are you? There are so many challenges that are not going away, aren't there? So do we feel hard-pressed, perplexed, persecuted, struck down? At times, I think we can probably tick all of these. Come with me then for a journey back in time. I want you to take you for a moment back to the Old Testament and take a brief look at Nehemiah. I'd suggest perhaps you go away and read, particularly the first 4 chapters. Do you remember Nehemiah? He was called by God to go and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem with a remnant of God's people. It's a crazy task. And we're told that Nehemiah was a mere cupbearer to the king. He had nothing of himself to recommend him to wall building and leadership, to restoring the good name of the people of Israel, to fending off the vicious, mean-spirited officials who didn't want to see anything good come from Jerusalem. Who was he for such an awesome and challenging task? But the key thing was, Nehemiah may have been hard-pressed and perplexed and feeling crushed, but we read in chapter 2 that when the opposition came from the officialdom and they mocked and ridiculed him, saying, "What is this that you are doing?" Nehemiah answered them by saying, "The God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. As for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any historic right to it." He knew what he was called to, and he knew who had called him, and he knew where his authority lay. So then in chapter 4, Nehemiah had got permission to go back and build the wall, and the work had got underway in chapter 3 with everybody pulling their weight, and each family had their own task and their own area of work. Nehemiah was a leader. He organised. He kept watch, but he also built alongside them. From the beginning, he is told it is a fruitless task. There are too many hurdles to cross. But his affirmation is that God will give us success, because it is what he has been called to do. Likewise, Paul knows that he's an apostle and a leader and a preacher for the Corinthians, which is why he continues to teach them, admonish them, and share his own pain, but all the time declaring, "But I have the very life of Jesus living within me. That is where my authority lies." I think from where we sit right now, after nearly 5 months of not meeting together, we can feel as a church, the body of God's people, that society is against us, that the rug has been pulled from under our feet. How can the strength of God's church shine again in a visible sense? How can we truly be the light shining in the darkness if we cannot be seen? I saw something interesting on the local news last week. The Bishop of Norwich was conducting a service of ordination in the cathedral, which was a major event which hasn't been able to happen earlier in the year. But the thing that struck me was the phrase that the reporter used right at the end of this account. He said, "At last the church is able to meet again." I wanted to kind of shout at the screen, really, and say, but the church has been meeting all along. It's just that you haven't seen us. So while we may have a greater presence online and more people joining our live streamed worship than have joined our services for a long time, our visible presence feels weak. The ability to rebuild the church as it was feels weak. The hoops that the authorities are making us jump through feel insurmountable. But what was Nehemiah's response to these same type of circumstances? The God of heaven will give us success. We read in chapter 4 that the opposition felt so strong that the people who had been working with him say, the strength of the labourers is giving out, and there is so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall. Also our enemies said, before they know it or see us, we will be right there among you, and we will kill you and put an end to your work. And the Jews that lived near, they came along and told us 10 times over, wherever you turn, they will attack you. It's all a waste of time, is what they're being told. They might as well have said what Paul wrote centuries later. We're hard pressed, pressures from all around. We're perplexed, being cornered. We're persecuted, being hounded, and we're struck down, brought low and depressed. Nehemiah's reaction to this is to remind them that the Lord God who fights for them is great and awesome, and in the strength of that mighty God, he takes on the enemies by equipping the people and continuing the work. Therefore, they are not crushed, not in despair or abandoned, and not destroyed. So back to our passage in Corinthians then. It seems to me that there are things here for individuals, leaders, and our churches to grasp when we put these two passages together. Firstly, are we facing oppression internally or externally? It can come from all sorts of directions. Have we actually recognised where and who the enemy is, where it's coming from, which is undermining our strength, our purpose, our health, our spirituality, and possibly our calling? Paul and Nehemiah both knew where the opposition was coming from, and their response was to stand on who they knew God to be. For Paul, God was the light of the world and Jesus the saviour of the world. For Nehemiah, God was sovereign over heaven and earth, and his power surpasses all things. Are we prepared to recognise our personal jar of clay and the possibility that our churches might be jars of clay, or our buildings anyway, so that we may move forward with the all-surpassing greatness of the power that is actually within us, with the sovereign God who is great and awesome and on our side? Perhaps we are used to the image of our bodies being the jar of clay, but what about the church? Have the walls of our churches become the strong haven, the place we long to be for safety? But it's been removed. But actually, it was only ever a jar of clay. If, however, we see the church as a collective group of people and the building that we happen to inhabit as a jar of clay that is fragile and short-term, then we realise that depending on the building for being church is as fragile as depending on our bodies, and it is only as strong as the all-surpassing power that resides within us. The power that is there in order to bring light into the darkness, the truth of Jesus into people's lives. That's the power which resides in each one of us as followers of Jesus. The walls of Jerusalem were rebuilt by Nehemiah because he was called to that work. And of course the people that worked with him. He didn't do it on his own. And the Church of Christ did go from strength to strength through those churches, just like Corinth. For in each situation they knew the treasure that they had within to rebuild and to build. Perhaps all of this COVID-19 has clearly shone the light on our weakness and fragility, both as human beings and perhaps as church. The people who went to build the wall with Nehemiah went as a remnant, as with a mustard seed of faith and a belief that God had called them to rebuild. They stumbled when opposition came. So did the Corinthians, to whom Paul is writing. However, the answer was and is knowing the calling. The answer was and is knowing the one who calls and the one who saves. So do we, you and I, have the treasure within to rebuild, to be the church and the people God calls us to be, to know the calling and to know who calls, and to know that no matter what we look like from the outside, like my bedraggled teddy, we have the treasure within? Or are we perplexed, hard-pressed, persecuted and struck down? Let's turn then to the final verses from our reading in Corinthians, verses 16 to 18. Therefore, we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary and what is unseen is eternal. May you know that you have the treasure of Jesus within when you are his follower, and it is with that treasure that you can build anything that he calls you to.